Good afternoon, all. Apologies for having been late. I was at a congressional hearing on human rights violations by IS, and it ran a little bit late because apparently Congress was voting on your budget. So just a heads up, there may be something to look up for. It's a pleasure to be here again. And I consider myself a personal friend of both Nina's and Hudson. And Sam is also someone we're all very proud of. So it's a privilege to be sharing a stage and being able to be here with you all. We have seen a lot happen over the past 4 years. What was so poetically referred to as the Arab Spring turned into somewhat of a challenge for the whole region. Originally, it was thought to be a challenge only for the Christians, but matters unfolded in a way that was probably very difficult for any of us to expect. We expected difficulties, we expected challenges, but I think few of us expected what actually has happened now. Terrorism in the past has taken a few positions: attacks, churches, individuals. But we have never seen orchestrated attacks of this sort, or indeed the declaration of a self-acclaimed state. Persecution is nothing new to the Middle East or to Christians in the Middle East. As Christians, we see ourselves as indigenous people, being there for 2,000 years, being very much part of the establishment, life, ethos, the whole system of being in the Middle East, and therefore have time and time again rejected minority status. But the rise of what is now a caliphate, an Islamic rule, is proving more dangerous. It is not only dangerous to Christians, which is expected, but it's dangerous because there is an ever-narrowing perspective, a mold that is becoming smaller and smaller, and only those who fit very precisely within the confines of that mold are seen to, in some strange way, have the right to live or exist. And that is as drastic as it is. That is as harsh as it is. People are seen to be given a right to life, a right to exist, a right to be part of this community only if they share in a very particular perspective. And this goes beyond borders. It is a global understanding. One thing we should be thankful for is that this caliphate model could actually have existed in Egypt. Because while still elected president, while still the legitimate head of Egypt, the then President Morsi actually called for a caliphate in Sinai. And so what we are seeing today in Iraq, what we have seen happen in Iraq, in Libya, could very easily have happened in Egypt and affected the largest Christian presence in the Middle East. We have seen a depletion of numbers. We've seen a drastic drop, especially in Iraq, in Libya. In Syria, the Christians are struggling. In Lebanon, there is such a pressure. In Egypt, of course, there is a pressure, but because of the sheer number, the bulk of Christians there is a greater stability. A stability because Egypt has a different makeup. Many thought that Egypt would fall into civil war. I was one of those who didn't share that fear, because Egypt does not have a tribal setting. It is rural. People are part of larger rural communities, and it's very difficult to divide those into a state which could suddenly bring up a civil war, as we've seen in other parts. It also has a predominantly Sunni Muslim community. There is a small presence of Shiites, some of whom were brutally murdered in those years of the Morsi rule. A Sufi presence, but the bulk of the presence is Sunni. And so again, there isn't the danger that we have seen in Iraq of a Sunni-Shia conflict. What came after the uprising? What came after the Arab Spring? What came after the failed states, the failed systems, was a near anarchic existence that actually meant that people were taking the law into their own hands. Security forces were depleted. In Egypt, the police force actually disappeared for a while. The army took over. Armies are not made to patrol streets, they're made to patrol borders. And so we had vigilante groups start to arise. And in the midst of this, we saw attacks on churches and Christians in those few months, in those few years, that exceeded the 20 years prior. Because there was a lawlessness there. We had one situation on the outskirts of Cairo where a group decided that they no longer wanted a church in their village, so they stole a bulldozer from a local municipal yard and they demolished the church. It was that simple. And of course, because of that breakdown, the suddenly discovered national identity in Egypt broke down very quickly as well, because it was hijacked by another religious identity. The communities then became more marginalized, and they became more at the receiving end of what we saw as a targeted persecution. In a statement that I made in 2014, September of 2014, I wrote that while Christians continue to suffer the brunt of these dangerous levels of exclusion and dehumanization, the Yazidis and other religious ethnic minorities, including some Muslims, also suffer them. There was also a warning in that same statement that the IS model that was now put out as a reality and that was de facto acknowledged by people was going to be replicated. This wasn't just about Mosul, it wasn't just about Iraq, it wasn't just about Syria, it became Libya and further afield. There have been terrorist attacks in Egypt that have been claimed by people who say they are IS affiliates. And in the midst of all of this, we see a greater marginalization of a greater number of people in the Middle East. Christians in the Middle East have a very important place. They are a buffer. They are a well-positioned buffer between two great groupings of Muslims that sometimes will spiral into anger and into violence. When we had the attacks on the churches in Egypt in August of 2013, unprecedented in nature, 50 churches, 50 other places of Christian ministry, in an orchestrated attack that went over 48 hours. I was interviewed very soon after and asked if I thought they were orchestrated. And in my view, I said yes, and being orchestrated was actually the best case scenario. I was hoping they were orchestrated, because if they weren't, it meant that there was a very thin artificial veneer that, once broken, meant that Muslims just wanted to attack every church in Egypt. But in fact, after that spate of attacks, that series of attacks, nothing else happened. The intention, according to some, was that the Christians would become angered, they would retaliate, they would strike out at the Muslim majority community, it would retaliate, Egypt would fall into an anarchy, and there'd be a calling back of the former president. When the Christians did not retaliate, that ruined the potential plan. Christians were just being Christians, they were being themselves. There was no memo that went out. There was no public announcement that said don't retaliate. We found people just taking that course of action. In actual fact, what they did was went on the charred walls of their burnt churches and wrote biblical verses about forgiving the other and loving the other. And that changed Egypt, and it changed the region. Christians only have a place in the Middle East because they're resilient, because they hold on to their land, because they feel that they are an indigenous part of the lands in which they live, and because a lot of them don't want to leave. There are people who are staying in place although they are at great risk, but they're meaning to weather the storm. There is a move at the moment towards speaking about whether Christians should stay or leave. And there are people on both sides of the argument. There are those who will say they must stay. They must maintain the Christian presence in the place of the birth of Christianity. And there are others who will say they have to leave. They have no presence. I have a simple solution. Ask them. There is no single model of Christian presence in the Middle East. The situation of Egyptian Christians is very different to the situation of Lebanese Christians, Iraqis, Syrians, Libyans, etc. I know that we as a church still have 90% of our Coptic Christians living in Egypt. And there is no great desire to leave. There was a lot said of a huge exodus of Christians. Some said up to 100,000, some 200. The number is unknown, but the number of people who left Egypt directly after the first presidential election and then the unrest was not confined to Christians. People of means who were able to leave, who were able to exit and set an exit strategy just in case the situation got worse, left. Christians and Muslims alike. Some of them came back and continued to live in Egypt. But the vast majority of Christians in Egypt don't want to leave. And let's face it, even if they did, where do you send 12 million people? The dynamics in Egypt, in the Middle East, have been when Christians are persecuted in one country, they move to the next. From Iraq to Syria, from Syria to Libya, from Libya to Lebanon, and people moved. But when you have a series of failed states, where there is no safety, not only for the Christians who are coming in, but for the people themselves of that same nation, Christian or Muslim alike, where do they go? Lebanon now is said to be 40% refugee. That is a huge burden for that country to carry, yet it is carrying it. Some have gone to Jordan, but where do the rest go? In the West, with our own current financial status, with our problems that we continue to encounter, Asylum is very little. And even when doors are opened, they're opened to very few. So, the answer is not to suddenly empty the region of Christians. That may be the simple textbook answer. Let's just take out the equator. Well, if they are the problem, if the Christians are the problem, then we'll take them out. But the Christians aren't the problem. The Christians aren't the ones who caused the meltdown in Iraq. If you take the Christians out, then there will still remain conflict. The answer is to look at the Christian presence and see its value. Look at them as important constituent members of societies, of cultures, of nations, of which they have been part for generations, for centuries, for millennia. And to try to see that they continue to have that role. The importance is to see that there is a value in them as individuals, not just as nominal Christians who have to be there so we look like we are an accepting state, but they are people who are valued in their own right, within their own context, in their own culture, in their own faith. The importance of looking at this message is completely counter to the trend that we see at the moment. I just came from earlier today, the National Press Club, in which we spoke about coverage of Christians in the Middle East. And there is a desire, there is a tendency to try to generalize, to bring lowest common denominator, to speak about that, and to think that everyone is affected by the same thing in the same way. But in actual fact, we need to consider individuals. As I said, ask them. In the model that I've spoken about, in Egypt, the vast majority of Christians don't want to leave. I was privileged enough to meet with the Maronite Patriarch here in Washington, the last time he was here, for a summit in which Christian leaders came from around the Middle East to stand together and speak about persecution in solidarity. And his message was very similar to our message and the message of our Patriarch and our Pope. But I've heard from bishops in Iraq who I've spoken with and dealt with, met with personally, who say that in certain areas of Iraq there is no longer a tenable existence for them. Trust has been broken down in these communities. Neighbors who lived side by side for generations felt abandoned, betrayed, and so therefore they can't go back. So where do they go? In focusing on Christians, we need to try to understand who they are, how they want to exist, and where they want to exist. Who they are, they see themselves very much as part of the region. They see themselves very much as part of its fabric. And I know it's a cliched word that has unfortunately been used over and over again, but they are. They see themselves as that. They've been pushed to the peripheries. They've been alienated. They have been forced out at times, but they still see themselves as part. The only way ahead for them, though, is how do they want to exist? As valued members. Within Egypt, within the other states, there needs to be a pragmatic, intentional approach towards nation building, towards accepting these people as a reality in the state, as part of its formation and foundation, and valued as members. And to create a top-down agenda that says every person is valued. I would hope, and I've said this before, and I'm sorry if you're bored of hearing me say it, one day I would really hope that we can look at the Middle East and forget about Christians and Muslims, so that the community would reach a state of advancement at which people could say, with all due respect, as much as I love and care about you, I don't care what your religion is. I care that you are someone I value. And I value you because, unlike what we've seen over the past few weeks and months, in beheadings, burning alive, live burials, trafficking of women and young girls, with that dehumanizing treatment, there's no longer I can look at the other as an equal. The other becomes an object I can barter with, I can bargain with, I can trade off for a message or for money. So I don't want to look at you like that anymore. I want to look at you as a creation of God. And I'm sorry, my predominant hat is that of a minister. And so I go back to that which God desired for humanity, creating us in His image and His likeness, creating us equal before Him, loving us equal before Him, and knowing that we share in humanity a shared brokenness that can be returned from with repentance. But I must repent from what I'm doing. Directly after the attacks and beheadings of these 21 Christians, my first statement was one of forgiveness, and people thought that was very strange. But it's the only thing we know how to do. We've never, as Coptic Christians, taken up arms. We've never fought violently. But we still remain as the largest Christian presence in the Middle East. There must be a reason for that. When I called for forgiveness, I made it very clear. We forgive the perpetrators, but the action is criminal. The action is heinous. Unacceptable if we are going to keep developing. The question is not whether Christians will continue in the Middle East. The question is how. Will they be comfortable, valued members, living with equality? Or will they be those who are tolerated as second, third, fifth class citizens? I was challenged by a gentleman once who couldn't understand why I was offended by the concept of jizya, the tax. And my answer was, because I don't think you would legitimize paying mafia protection money in New York. And even with payment of that tax, you are protected as a different type of citizen. And so that's not a way ahead. That needs to be challenged. There needs to be a challenge to the education system, to the values taught. There was a challenge by the Egyptian president to Al-Azhar University that their syllabus must be changed, that their attitude must be changed, because there were verses there that were used to legitimize the actions of groups like ISIS and those that might come up later. I'm here in the presence of those who know much more than I about all of this, and I thank you for allowing me to speak. And amongst you as well, there are those who understand the situation. But I would ask for one thing, and that is we continue to look at the Middle East within its own context. It does face a risk. Christians face a risk. Let us stop trying to import Western models of how the Middle East should live. But let us try to work with the leadership there and develop whatever exists into a viable model for every person there. Christian, Muslim, atheist, religious or secular. Everyone who wants to be part of a community and everyone who wants to be part of a productive presence. If you allow me, I want to close with a verse. Comes from the second epistle to the Corinthians of St. Paul, who says, "We are hard-pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed." That is the state of the Christians in the Middle East. They are pressured. They are put into situations they may not have seen in contemporary history. They will continue to exist because they want to, because of the grace of God, because of their resilience. It is up to us to try to allow them to exist with a sense of dignity and importance and understanding of what they bring rather than the challenges that they pose. Thank you.